Well, we welcome everybody. We're glad that you're back with us for another discussion through the book of Genesis. Minister Joe Baldinger is joining me again. I don't know how long it's going to take us to finish this, Joe, but I'm enjoying it. So I'm not in any kind of a rush. But we're in Genesis chapter 43. And technically, we're going to start our conversation in verse 15 when it comes to the actual text we're dealing with today. But I had a few comments about the names of God that occur a little bit earlier. And for that conversation, we'd need to begin in verse 13.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I asked for Joe's permission to open the conversation with a little discussion of the names of God, just because I find it interesting. I'm sure you'll have some things to interject, Joe, but I'll carry it here, and then we'll pick up in verse 15 and more of a dialogue.
There you go.
So verse 13 of Genesis chapter 43 says, "Take your brother also and be on your way to the man." This is Jacob speaking to his sons when he's finally relented and allowed them to go back a second time to Egypt, and this time to take Benjamin. And then he says, "May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man." We had been discussing in previous weeks that when Joseph talked about God, he used a very generic term. He used the Hebrew term Elohim, which can refer to the one true God, absolutely. It also can be translated gods with a little g, and can refer to pagan gods, and certainly the gods of Egypt. And I had mentioned that by using the generic term Elohim, Joseph was not giving too much away as to what he personally believed. He wasn't indicating to them that they worship the same God necessarily. This was a very generic way, and they probably heard him, his brothers probably heard him speaking about Egyptian gods. That's probably how they interpreted what he was saying. But this name, God Almighty, is an interesting one. It's El Shaddai in Hebrew, or El Shaddai. And we're maybe more familiar in the church with the story of God's revelation of his name to Moses, because Moses asks him when he sends him to Egypt to confront Pharaoh and to tell the Israelites that he's going to deliver them from slavery. Moses asks God, well, by what name? What name should I tell them? Who are you? And God, if we were reading well, is surprising in his response, because he does give a name to Moses that had not been revealed before. My thought is that Moses expected him to say El Shaddai. And the reason I think that would be the expectation is because of Genesis. So Genesis chapter 17, verse 1 is a record of God coming to make a covenant with Abraham. It's not the first covenant he made. He made one in Genesis chapter 12. He expanded it in Genesis chapter 15. And then he comes back in chapter 17. And these, you might say they're all the same covenant, but they're certainly being expanded. And in Genesis 17, God adds the condition of circumcision to the covenant. He hadn't said that in 12. He had not said that in 15, but it's there in 17. And it's in Genesis chapter 17, verse 1, that God reveals his name to Abraham. Up until then, I don't know who Abraham thought he was or how Abraham spoke to him. But Genesis 17:1 says, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless. So that's the name Abram knew God as. So I anticipate that when Moses said, tell me your name, he might have expected to receive the same answer Abraham had received, where God would say, I am El Shaddai. But God doesn't do that. God tells Moses his name is I am that I am, which the Hebrew people later turned into Yahweh. So I am is Ehyeh, which means I am. And they called him something like Yahweh, which is he is. So that becomes God's name. That name is reflected in Genesis, probably because Moses was writing it back in, but it was not a name revealed to Abraham. Abraham knew God as El Shaddai. And what's interesting in the verse here with Jacob is that though Joseph's been calling God just Elohim, very generic, probably trying to conceal his identity, when Jacob sends his sons, he calls him El Shaddai. And so I wanted to notice that. that this is a very unique Abrahamic way of speaking of God. But I also wanted to bring this up because how to translate that name is a matter of some debate. So it's traditionally translated, as it is in the New Revised Standard Version that we just read, as God Almighty. And it all depends on how you translate the word Shaddai. So we're not sure what that word is from. Traditionally, we have preferred to believe it's from the Hebrew word shaddad, which means to devastate, to ruin, to destroy, to deal violently with. If it's from shaddad, then it doesn't really mean Almighty, it means God the Destroyer.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think that's what Shaddai is from, and there are a great many scholars of ancient Hebrew and pre-Hebrew who don't think that's what Shaddai is from.
Mm-hmm.
The other option is the Hebrew word shad, which means breast. It's a female breast, which comes from or is related to the word shadah, which means to moisten or to breastfeed, something like that. And if it is from Shad, which I think is most likely, then the name El Shaddai is indicating a God who nurtures or suckles his children, a God who cares and watches over the way a mother does an infant.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a matter of debate whether God revealed himself to Abraham as God the Destroyer or as God the Nurturer. And you could say, couldn't it be both? Well, Shaddai probably isn't related to both. These are very different words. They sound the same to us, but Shaddad and Shad are not the same any more than certain words in English that might sound the same are spelled differently and have different origins. So there probably is something. So it's a matter really of interpretation. Historically, Shad as breast was too feminine, and there's been a fear in the church of associating too many feminine qualities with God, lest there be confusion. So I think there's been a push away from that. But Jesus wasn't afraid to associate feminine qualities with God. Like Jesus says when he comes to Jerusalem, I think it's in Luke chapter 9, but somewhere around there. He says, "How, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who've slaughtered the prophets," and so on, "how I've longed to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings." Jesus isn't afraid to use a very feminine word there. And so my sense is, I think God was revealing to Abraham his name as God, the one who is caring for you, who's nurturing you. But 2 chapters later in Genesis 19, after God reveals this name, he does destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. So does he intend, is it a violent name that God gives him, a threatening name, a fearful name, or does he give him a nurturing, caregiving name? You have to decide. But I thought it'd be an interesting conversation, and it's one that's debated by philologists today, people who study language and its origins. But anyway, Almighty is a really safe, careful interpretation without really taking too much of a side on that debate. It could go the destructive way, or it could go the breast way if you take breast as mountain with warriors coming out of the mountains or something like that. Almighty can kind of bridge the gap, but it's really probably either destroyer or nurturer. I don't know that there are many other options. And the old lexicons, the old dictionaries coming out of like the 1800s or whatever, associated Shaddai with Shaddad, to destroy, to ruin. That's where they associated it. It usually falls under that in those dictionaries, but more recent scholarship is less afraid of the feminine qualities and has argued pretty forcefully, in my view, that it's probably related to breast and not related to destroying. But anyway, do you have any response, Joe? I know I like that kind of thing, especially because I think names reveal something, and God is trying to reveal something to Abraham at the very least by telling him that name. But it's a matter of debate what he's revealing.
Right. Within this context, though, it would appear that Jacob is, when he uses the idea of "May God Almighty grant you mercy," that sounds more like the nurturing side
It
as
does.
opposed to
And
the wrathful.
yeah, and that's one of the evidences that modern, like more contemporary philologists use for saying it's probably related to breast, because almost every time that name appears in Genesis, and you'd have to do your research to see if it, almost every time, it's used in a nurturing context. It's not often, it's certainly not always, and I would say not even often used purely in destructive text. That's not the way that it would go. But in Jacob's case, this is the name that he knows God by, because this was the name given to Abraham, and Abraham passed it down to Isaac, and I'm sure Isaac passed it down to Jacob. So he may not be using it deliberately. He might think of it the way you or I think of Jehovah or Yahweh. We don't think of the origins, we just think it's God's name.
Mm.
And he may be doing the same. It may not be highly theological, but it is interesting, as you've just said, that he uses it in a passage where he's hoping God will watch over them.
Mm.
This is not a passage where he hopes God will go before them and destroy their enemies. It's
Right.
really a passage where he hopes God will watch over them.
Yeah, and as that being said as well, it says, "Grant you mercy before the man." So in other words,
Yeah,
it
and
almost
that
takes the
adds, I'm so glad you pointed that out, Joe. I know I'm interrupting a lot, but that this gets me a little bit excited, because you may not know this. I know I didn't know it till I learned Hebrew, but the word for mercy there is the word rahamim, which in the singular means womb. In the plural, it means intestines or loins, and it almost always refers to compassion. There's an old English King James, I think, era saying bowels of mercy,
Mm.
which meant that you were feeling compassionate or something like that, sympathetic. And it comes from the New Testament will also say, use the bowels in terms of compassion. But in the singular form, it means womb. So there's a lot of feminine characteristics here, right? May the nurturing God take you into his womb,
Mm.
right? Or care for you as a, it's very interesting language, but it's very feminine in the sense that it's very nurturing. And I don't want to, here I'm always hedging my bets. I know it's a little out of favor to think of the feminine as more nurturing and the masculine as more demanding or something like that, because in our day, there's a lot more egalitarian concern. But in the biblical days, those ways of thinking of masculine and feminine were very common.
Yeah. Also, what I was pointing to was the idea that it seems to take the power or the authority away from Joseph, the man, and lay it more into the hands of God as the authoritative power, which
Yeah,
is which
Jacob
is
is appealing to God
yeah, yeah,
to help them. And that makes sense, right? Because the last encounter with Joseph didn't go well.
right.
And Jacob wants to be sure that God is involved this time. And he's asking for mercy, for
Mhm.
rachamim
Mhm.
from El Shaddai. I think he's asking for care, for protection, for watching over.
Yeah.
But if you think of Shaddai as violent imagery, which is traditional, there would be some specter of violence in this that he'd be asking for.
Well, the mercy is as well the next phrase where it says that he may send back your brother and Benjamin.
Yeah, and we had said in our last discussion, we thought maybe Jacob assumed Simeon to be dead. There's at least hope that he's not.
Right. Unless the brother is that hope for
For Joseph, I don't
that
know
would
if
be
maybe Jacob really did his research and he thinks Joseph may have been sold to slavery. But as far as we know in the story, Jacob believes Joseph's been torn to pieces by wild animals.
yeah, yeah,
I don't
yeah.
think he's referring to Joseph myself, but
No, he's not. That's just saying that would be the long hope for sure.
yeah, well, and certainly an ironic twist to the story is that the
Yeah,
other brother does end up being Joseph.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, true enough. So thanks for indulging me on doing a little language background, but I don't know, those sorts of things are interesting to me. I hope they're interesting to some of our listeners. But we'll pick up in verse 15 and read through. Well, I'll let you decide when to stop. It's up to you. Would you want to read this for us, starting in verse 15 of chapter
Yeah,
43?
yeah, I can do that. Just one more comment before we get there.
Yeah.
Is the emphasis of on Jacob about his children? Doesn't It's no longer about all the flocks that he got from Laban. It's not really all about the women, the wives. It it seems like all he really cares about in life right now is his offspring.
Yeah.
Or that seems what's most important to him, should I say? I mean, the survival of the family, kind of thing.
And that's the front and center of the theme of this story. That's the way that Moses and perhaps the prophetic tradition of Israel later have preserved this story. What's important here is the future of the people of Israel. So the food and the animals and other things that were key in previous stories, like with Abraham and Lot and their decision to separate because they had so many flocks, or in the story of Jacob and Esau, where Jacob is trying to really bribe Esau's affection. Well, first he's competing with Esau for all this stuff, and then once he comes back, he's bribing him with gifts. It's a little bit here, but I agree with you. The most pronounced concern is the future of the people of Israel by this point in Genesis. And Jacob, as Israel himself, is very concerned about his children and about the future. And that makes sense. As Moses is looking back, that would be the most important thing to Moses.
Right. I mean, because it says, "I am bereaved. If I'm bereaved of my children, I am bereaved." It doesn't say my sons. It says all of his children. So this is all part of the process of getting the food and the law. I mean, the loss of Benjamin, I think, is at the forefront.
Yeah, possibly. This is not something that I looked up before. So I'm looking it up. The problem for me here is that I'm looking at the Hebrew and I just don't see
Where they come up with that?
the word sons there. Yeah, no, sons isn't there. I'm sure of it. I'm looking at the Hebrew and I just see a repetition. I am bereaved, I am bereaved. That's all it says.
Yeah.
So they
So
must have added the phrase of my children just for clarity.
sure.
But there might be something with the repetition of bereaved,
Uh-huh.
because even translating it with an if, that
That's questionable.
it's not there, but I'm trying to remember. It's been a long time since I've taught more advanced grammar in Hebrew on how if-then statements, conditional statements are formed. But I would expect to see the Hebrew word for if here. Im it is, I think, and it's not here.
Mm-hmm.
Literally what it says is, and I, just as I am bereaved, I am bereaved. So I'm assuming the grammarians have a better sense than I do of conditional statements
Mm-hmm.
and how they might be structured. And this might be somewhat advanced in its structuring. But it looks to me on face value, as I look at the Hebrew, that it could easily be translated as a lament of Jacob. I'm praying to God that he'll send back your other brother and Benjamin, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
bereaved. I'm bereaved. He
Everything's
may be
against me.
lamenting the fact that just in sending Benjamin, he's already lost and he's asking God to give them back. I think that's more likely as I look at the Hebrew, but I might be missing something.
A repeat of the I. Everything is against me.
Right. Almost as though he's asked God to send them back and then he's turned away and he's just crying out, I'm bereaved, I'm bereaved.
Mm.
As for me, I'm bereaved, I'm bereaved. Like he's lost them.
Right.
And only God can give them back. I think that's more likely what's going on here, but maybe I'm missing something. I can say for certain the Hebrew word for if is not there.
Yeah.
And the Hebrew words, that phrase of my children is not there.
So it's basically in there for to clarify and muddy the
Trying to
waters.
clarify his meaning, but it may also obscure maybe the depth of his grief and what giving Benjamin away really felt like to him, where he preparing himself for never getting him back. And I think there's a sense, no matter how you translate this, that he's saying to the Lord, you're going to have to bring him back, otherwise he's not going to come.
Right.
So there is a desperation here in Jacob's prayer.
Reminds me a bit of the prodigal son.
Yeah. Or David too. I'm thinking of his prayer for Absalom, even though Absalom was a pretty wicked son. My son, my son.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so picking up in verse 15. So the men took the present, and they took double the money with them, as well as Benjamin. They went on their way down to Egypt and stood before Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, "Bring these men into my house and slaughter an animal. Make ready for the men, for the men are to dine with me at noon." The man did as Joseph said and brought the men to Joseph's house. Now the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house and they said, "It is because of the money we placed in our sacks the first time that we have been brought in, so that he may have an opportunity to fall upon us, to make slaves of us, and take our donkeys." So they went up to the steward of Joseph's house and spoke with him at the entrance to the house. They said, "Oh, my lord, we came down the first time to buy food. And when we came to the lodging place, we opened our sack, and there was each one's money in the top of the sack, our money in full weight. So we have brought it back with us. Moreover, we have brought down with us additional money to buy food. We do not know who put our money in our sacks." He replied, "Rest assured, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father must have put treasures in your sacks for you. I received your money." Then he brought Simeon out to them. When the steward had brought the men into Joseph's house and gave them water, and they washed their feet, and when they had given their donkeys fodder, they made the present ready for Joseph's coming at noon, for they had heard that they would dine there.
So we had mentioned, I don't know if we want to reiterate the names of these sons, but Benjamin means son of my right hand, which means strength. The right hand, there are left-handed people. Ironically, the Benjamites were known in the history of Israel for being left-handed.
Huh.
Which is ironic, since the name of their tribe is son of my right hand. But anyway, Benjamites were quite proficient warriors, and many of them, at least the ones that get mentioned, like in David's fighting forces and so on, who were Benjamites, they're all left-handed, which gave them quite an advantage in battle. But the name of the tribe is son of my right hand, which means son of my strength. Most people were right-handed at that time, as they are today. So the right hand usually represented strength.
Mm-hmm.
So this has to do with Benjamin's power or might. And Joseph name meant to add, and his mother had named him Joseph because she was hoping for other children. May the Lord add to me other children. I don't know if that matters, but we've made a big deal of names. We talked about Joseph's sons, forgetfulness and fruitfulness, and all of that. So, but these are brothers. Joseph and Benjamin are full brothers, same father, same mother. And so Joseph has been waiting for this for a long time, would you say?
Oh yeah, and he's been watching for them. We talked about the last time when they came down, that for some reason Joseph seemed to know that they were coming, and with all these people around, he was still able to identify his brothers. So he's looking for them at this point. And it's been some time, I think, though, isn't it? The only assumption I have is based on what Judah said. He could, by the time that we waited, go on this trip. He said this earlier in the chapter that we could have gone and done it twice
Right.
in the amount of time that we waited. So
Yeah, and even if they're going real slow, and let's say they took a week to get there and back, that's really only saying 4 weeks. So there was a lot of debate, but I'm assuming that the food lasted much longer than a month.
yeah, further on, I recall from just further reading, Joseph makes a comment about the years of famine. I think they're 2 years into the seven
Okay.
of
So that's a detail I don't remember. So if that's the case, then maybe I don't know how long the food would have lasted if they were buying food based on months or trying to get a year's worth. I don't know. But Joseph sees them and he prepares a meal where he slaughters an animal. And that's no small thing
right.
to do because meat is expensive.
Hmm.
And it's not that the commoner didn't eat meat. Certainly at festivals and other things, they would have eaten meat. And I'm sure that there were cheaper cuts and things of that sort. But to kill an animal and to serve it is a pretty royal reception.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty big deal that he's doing this. And it would have been quite an expense at this time. Certainly the high class Egyptians ate meat all the time.
Yeah.
But for visitors from out of town who were last time they were here accused of being spies, this is a pretty big gesture.
Right. And then the timing is what's interesting to me. He says, we're gonna dine at noon. I
Yeah.
I don't I mean that are we talking like the heat of the day? There's not a lot of time there to slaughter an animal, drain all its blood out, prep it and cut the meat and then cook it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
imagine that they're pretty good at this, but I agree. And his brothers, as I said, this is a big gesture. And his
Right.
brothers don't believe it. They think it's an occasion for something else. They think they're going to be arrested. Right? They don't
Yeah.
believe for 1 second that this guy is serving them a pig. They're having a roast. They don't
Yeah.
believe that at all.
Yeah. It's certainly not a pig.
Yeah. So they're afraid.
Yeah.
They know that the money they paid for the grain was returned to them. So they're terrified that this is recompense, that have been accused as thieves. I just want to make sure we see why they're so afraid. This is
Mhm.
an excessive invitation. Like, oh, he wants you to come to his house. He's going to kill an animal. He's going to feed you a nice big feast. And they're just like, oh, we're dead.
We are the feast.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not the animal that's going to be roasted. So they try to get ahead of the story, right? They try to, as we would say today, control the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
When the steward comes to speak to them, they jump right into it.
Right. Right.
And they explain to him that they're aware they took too much money last time and they brought it back with them. They're just trying to get ahead of the story here.
Right. And there's an assumption that the steward is the same guy
Yeah, I don't
as
know. I don't know
before.
how quickly people, again, it's hard to know how much time this is. It might be. I think if you're reading the story plainly, you'd think it was.
Yeah.
He tries to relieve them of their fear by saying, I got your money. Your God must have put it in your sack. And that is Elohim. It is the generic term for God and can mean the one God, but this is an Egyptian. So he needs to specify which God he's talking about. And he is very clear. It must have been the God of your father. Now, he doesn't know the name El Shaddai, probably. He's an Egyptian.
Mm-hmm.
That was revealed to Abraham. But that's how an Egyptian would clarify.
I mean, specifically though, they call him Lord, and that's disrespect. Oh my Lord, come down
Right.
first time to buy food. I'm sure that's disrespect because they are afraid that they're going to be made slaves and they're going to steal their donkeys.
Yeah. Yeah. And the word Lord there is the word Adon, which is what Adonai comes from, which we hear, but it's a generic word for Lord or master. Yeah. God is called that quite a lot because he is their Lord and master, but it's used also of people. So he brings out Simeon to them. He brings them into Joseph's house, gives them water. washes their feet, which probably just means he was being hospitable. I don't think he's going out of his way to do anything that they wouldn't have done for a guest.
Right.
Feeds the donkeys, and then gets them ready for Joseph to come. So he really does. There's no reason they should think they're in trouble.
Right.
If anything,
Right.
it sounds like they're being honored. They came back, they brought their little brother,
Yeah.
but they're guilty immediately. They don't even think that this could be a good reception, even though there's every indication that it is.
Yeah. It's that guilty conscience, huh?
Yeah, they're terrified. And of course, Joseph, I'm sure that they didn't trust Egyptians. I'm sure there's some racism and prejudice that goes on at this time for sure. And they clearly don't trust Joseph, and they're still smarting from the rough treatment they got the last time. So maybe they have a hard time believing this. They think they're being set up for something, but really there's no indication of that. It looks like they're being very warmly received.
Right. Right. Yeah, it does seem like that. And that the big thing is that money, the money in that was in their sacks.
Yeah, that's the guilt that they have. And maybe Reuben's words are still echoing that they still expect to be punished for what they did to Joseph, and they're just expecting that at every minute.
Hmm.
And a guilty conscience can be like that, right? Where you expect to get caught or to
Right.
get in trouble for something, you read it into everything. And it strikes me as a very realistic story that even though they're being warmly received, they're paranoid. It's conspiracy theories galore. They are sure that they're being set up for something.
Right. Yeah, they seem to be. There's always that ring in the back of their mind. God is repaying our evil because of our brother.
Yeah, I think these guys they're not at peace. And there might be a little bit to that when you've done something terrible in your life and you don't feel like you've really paid the penalty for it, fear may be a constant companion.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, or suspicion of everything. I mean, they're in a foreign land. Anything could happen, kind of thing.
And a lot's on the line, right? Because Judah has promised that if Benjamin doesn't come back with them, if anything bad happens, that he's going to bear the shame the rest of his life. So there's a lot at stake, a lot more at stake in this trip personally than they thought was at stake in the first one.
That's right. Not as much more. You got the
Yeah, now
man.
there's much more. So they also prepare, it told us in verse 25, that gift from their father, that they've got it ready. So when Joseph comes, they're going to lead with that. Reminds me of Jacob leading with the gifts when he met Esau. That must be a cultural thing that you lead with a present.
Yeah. In our day, grease the wheels.
And this still happens a little bit in our day. Like there are still people who believe that you should bring a gift if you're invited over somebody's house. And we certainly greet each other with a smile or a handshake as a way of saying that I'm not a threat, I'm friendly, don't worry about me.
Yeah, we're not going to kill you.
Right. Yeah. So, and probably every culture has its way of giving those social cues that in this case, they're trying to say, you're the master, we're not, we're coming submissively to you.
Right.
Don't worry about us, we're good doobies,
That's
whatever.
right. We got, we brought some good stuff from our land.
Yeah.
I think we talked a little bit about that before, but as Joseph, I mean, he must have those items must have been like just comforting or
Yeah. They couldn't have known just how comforting because they don't know it's Joseph, but I'm sure that these were things from his home.
Mhm.
And I don't know if the stuff they grew in Egypt was exactly the same as the kind of stuff that grew in
Mhm.
Canaan, but I tend to think not because of what comes later. Remember, the Israelites end up as slaves in Egypt for over 400 years.
Mhm.
And when they're in the wilderness and God is telling them through Moses about the promised land of Canaan, he definitely describes the food as something different
Mhm.
than they would have been used to. So I'm assuming some of these foods might have taken Joseph back ages.
Yeah, right.
There's nothing quite like a food you grew up with.
That's right.
Well, you want to move into verse 26 here?
Sure, sure. When Joseph came home, they brought him the presents they had carried into the house and bowed down to the ground before him. He inquired about their welfare and said, "Is your father well? The old man of whom you spoke? Is he alive or still alive?" They said, "Your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive." And they bowed down their heads in obeisance. Then he looked up and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, "Is this your youngest brother, of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son." With that, Joseph hurried out because he was overcome with affection for his brother, and he was about to weep. So he went into a private room and wept there. Then he washed his face, came out, and controlling himself, said, "Serve the meal." They served him by himself, and them by themselves. And the Egyptians who ate with them by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for this is an abomination to the Egyptians. When they were seated before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth, the men looked at one another in amazement. Portions were taken to them from Joseph's table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of the others. They drank and were merry with him.
So we've been talking a lot, right? At least I have, about the birth order and how important it is to this story. And here it is front and center. Joseph aligns them by birth order. So he knows the order of succession here.
Mm-hmm.
And they're shocked. I mean, how would he know that?
Right.
Yeah. But that's at the end. But again, birth order is all over this story. It's why we keep going back to it. So they bow to him. This is a normal thing to do for a superior. You'll see Abraham even bows to some people.
Mm-hmm.
Melchizedek, for instance, and some others. This is a normal way of showing obeisance and submission. And Joseph leans right in to ask them questions about their welfare. This is a very welcome response.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, it's so different than the last time. Remember the last time they came, he spoke to them roughly.
You are spies.
Yeah, you're spies. This time he's killed the fattened calf. He's taken them in. He's fed their donkeys. He's got them all cleaned up. He's brought them into the house. He's now asking about their father. How's your dad? Is he still alive? Because you said he was really old, I remember. And they said, yeah, he's okay. He's still alive. And he said, this must be your brother. You know what? It's just such a different response. They must be blown away.
Yeah. Yeah, it's shocking.
In this passage, God answers Jacob's prayer.
Yeah, that's true.
Jacob asked that God would inspire mercy in the man.
Mm-hmm.
And that word was rahamim, right? Bowels, the womb in the singular. And what this actually says here in Hebrew, which is so interesting in verse 30, with that, Joseph hurried out because he was overcome with affection, is what the New Revised Standard Version says. But what it says is he was overcome with rachamim, with his bowels, which is exactly what Jacob prayed for.
Right.
So the response of Joseph to seeing Benjamin was exactly the prayer request of Jacob. Now you might say, but of course that's how Joseph would feel. Okay, but it's exactly what Jacob asked for. I mean, to the word, exactly what he asked for. So I find that just so interesting. And Joseph is so overwhelmed that he's afraid he's going to give away his emotion. And I said this before, and we'll say it again. Weeping in males was not considered effeminate in the ancient Near East at this time. It was a normal part of masculine emotional depth. So they wouldn't have thought he was out of control the way you might have thought a European ruler was out of control many, many millennia later. So it's that he doesn't want them to know he's feeling emotional about them. He's trying to conceal that, but not because it's an overflow of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
It is part of a normal masculine emotionality in this culture at this time. He just doesn't want them to see it.
Yeah, it appears to me too. He's continuing to test them to see their response, to see if they're contrite, see if they're really legit in their stories.
Right.
Also testing, I think, the very fact that they are deceptive. They could have brought another child. Judah could have used it, or Reuben could have used his own son. These kinds of things. So he's still testing them, I believe. But I like this imagery that you're talking about with the womb type of thing, because he's kind of giving that to them.
Yeah.
In all everything that he's doing here, and he's even being nice to them the way he's talking, like you're not spies, that kind of thing.
He goes into a private room. It's just the word cheder, which can be a private room or bedroom or something like that. But he leaves to conceal the fact that he's feeling emotional.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want them to see his mercy.
Mm-hmm. You know, the idea of controlling yourself. I mean, it's like he's probably so wanting them to know who he is, and yet he realizes too that the authority that he has over them, and then the whole fact that they're all there.
Yeah.
There might have even been some flashbacks of the, where they're tearing out his clothes,
and he does what we all do when we want to hide the fact that we've been crying. He washes his face.
Yeah. He wanted to gain composure, I think, is the real thing.
He tells his servants to serve the meal, literally serve the bread.
Mm-hmm.
And they serve him by himself. So this is such an interesting, I'd love to see this filmed. And I'm wondering what you make of this. So he's eating by himself. The Egyptians who ate with him were eating by themselves. And then his brothers are eating by themselves. So why is Joseph eating by himself? So he's here in charge of all of Egypt under Pharaoh, but he still has to eat alone. Because Egyptians don't eat with Hebrews. Do they know Joseph is a Hebrew? Well, they certainly know that he came from Canaan. I mean, he was sold as a slave by the Midianites. They certainly knew his origins. So he's eating by himself. So despite all this power, there's still a little bit of prejudice here with Joseph. But he's not eating with his brothers because he doesn't want them to know that he's one of them. But the Egyptians know he is. So he has to eat alone. He has them eating alone, so they think he's an Egyptian. And then he has the Egyptians eating alone. This is quite a complicated little scene.
Yeah, yeah. It's like a potluck dinner that all the food's being served to Joseph, and then he disperses it to his brothers. It's
well, my sense is here that they don't see him eating, that they're all separated. Do you not see it that way?
I kind of look at it, they're just round tables in there.
Oh, you think they're in the same room but at different tables?
Yeah.
I prefer to think of this as they're all in separate places.
I think it's more dramatic to if they're all in the same room.
You could be right about that. My suspicion is that the taboo against eating would never have been satisfied if you were still in the same room, just at a different table. I think that taboo was much stronger. And I might be influenced by the New Testament, where eating with tax collectors and sinners, you weren't supposed to be in the same room. It wasn't a matter of just being at a different table. It was not being even in the house. And my sense is here that this taboo would have been strong enough that Joseph would have been eating by himself in a chamber. The servants would have been by themselves, and his brothers would have been eating alone. That would be my impression, but you might be right. Maybe they're all in the same room.
Yeah, well, if they're in Joseph's house, so I don't know if that's like part of, if he just had his own house, and I know a lot of dwelling places only had like one big room and this kind of thing.
Right.
I don't
It's
really know, but it's I thought it was more along the lines that they just couldn't even look at each other while they're eating. It was just like I don't know what the detestable part is. Maybe you can help us out with that because I think the word abomination is a that's a that's a strong word, isn't it?
yeah. Toeva indicates some sort of ritual impurity. So it might be religious objection to eating with those who worshipped other gods. That
Interesting.
might be the sense of Toeva.
Hmm.
But that's the
Yeah,
word abomination is usually used in religious or ritual contexts. So
yeah. It would have been a different. It adds to the story though. It makes it more complicated to
it
say that
does, yeah.
they would meet together.
Yeah.
Uh,
And then when he has them seated, they're all in order. And this is the second time they are looking at each other, right? Remember the first time
yeah,
when they're
yeah.
starving? Jacob says, "Why are you looking at each other?"
Yeah, what's going on here? They're in amazement. Word
Yeah,
that's
that
used.
Joseph knew how to arrange them by birth order. And that's a big deal because this means that whoever this guy is, he knows who the important ones are.
Right. And then the portions are taken from Joseph's table and
Right.
and brought. So he's managing who gets what.
Yeah, and I don't know what's being indicated there. Like I said, my suspicion is it's because he was also a Hebrew that the food was taken from his table and not from the table of the servants. But it also could be indicating that it's a high honor. Maybe they are all in the same space and they watch it coming from his table. That's the way you interpreted it. All
Mhm.
those are on the table for me,
Mhm.
but I still suspect that the portions have to be taken from his table because to take them from the Egyptian table might have been the taboo we were talking about.
Mhm.
Yeah, and he gives Benjamin 5 times as much. What is that meant to indicate to the other brothers?
I'm not sure about the number. I don't know where the 5 times come.
5 times is excessive,
Yeah,
it seems to me. But it also seems to me that there's no doubt that Joseph has not only put them in birth order, but he has indicated to them that he knows Benjamin is the father's favorite and is the likely heir.
yeah,
And so he has treated him like birthright and blessing belong to him, like he's the head of this family. And that is a little detail that I think is true. And I think the brothers all know it's true, but they have no idea how this Egyptian would know that that's true.
yeah. If he's not an Egyptian, if they figured that much and gone that far, how in the world he could know this is amazing.
And Joseph's ability to know these things continues through the story and has them perplexed. And remember, later Joseph will tell them he's a diviner,
Right, right.
that he's an Egyptian who can discover hidden truths by magical arts. That's what he's going to tell them later. But right now, it looks like this guy is clairvoyant.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know why the 5 times. It is possible that that's about what the birthright and blessing together would be the equivalent of. Maybe Joseph knows the math, he knows the culture, or maybe he's being excessive. It feels excessive to me because I thought it was a double portion. This times 5 seems huge. Maybe Joseph knows something I don't. I'm very confident that he's signaling to the brothers that not only does he know their birth order, he also knows the likely heir.
Yeah. That's him controlling how much they actually get. Because the next phrase says that they drank and were merry with him.
I love how we translate these languages to make sure nobody's offended. But the word there translated merry is shachar, which means to be drunk.
Oh,
So they got drunk with him.
right, right. So if you go by the standard of the portions, Benjamin would be the drunkest.
Right, yeah. I don't know if he got 5 times the wine. They drank a lot.
Yeah, and let's be honest, this is probably the best traveling meal they've had.
Oh yeah, this is in a famine.
Yeah, yeah. So no matter what's happening, this is a good meal. Yeah, you know,
I do want to say I don't want to be criticizing the NRSV. To say that someone was merry is an old English way of saying they were drunk.
yeah,
So that's what they're saying, but they did it in such a old way that some people could read it and think, "Oh, look at how much fun they're having."
yeah. Well, I think it's kind of a diving board because we know that when Noah got drunk, there was problems.
Yeah,
We know that when Lot got drunk, there were problems.
right. To support what you're saying, the word used when Noah is said to be drunk in Genesis 9:21 is this same word.
Yeah.
This word doesn't occur in Genesis other than here and in the story of Noah. It only occurs twice.
Wow.
So maybe you're right. Maybe if we're reading Genesis in context, we should get a little sense of foreboding or inappropriateness here. I don't know.
Or at least saying, what in the world is going on here?
Yeah, I mean, if I were just reading this in context, I don't see any negative to this necessarily. But the connection with Noah, maybe there's a little specter.
Mm-hmm. Might be reaching, but worth noting, I think.
It's worth noting anyway, especially how infrequently the word is used.
Mm-hmm.
Really, in the Bible, it only occurs 18 times in the First Testament. So it's not a lot of times. And, you know, it is often used negative, not always, but it does carry with it a pretty negative connotation a lot of the time. I'm just glancing through the passages where it occurs.
Mm-hmm.
And so, anyway, chapter 44, verse 1, then he commanded the steward of his house, fill the men's sacks with food as much as they can carry, and put each man's money in the top of his sack. Put my cup, the silver cup, in the top of the sack of the youngest, with his money for the grain. And he did as Joseph told him. As soon as the morning was light, the men were sent away with their donkeys. When they had gone only a short distance from the city, Joseph said to his steward, go, follow after the men, and when you overtake them, say to them, why have you returned evil for good? Why have you stolen my silver cup? Is it not from this that my Lord drinks? Does he not indeed use it for divination? You have done wrong in doing this. When he overtook them, he repeated these words to them. They said to him, why does my Lord speak such words as these? Far be it from your servants that they should do such a thing. Look, the money that we found at the top of our sacks we brought back to you from the land of Canaan. Why then would we steal silver or gold from your Lord's house? Should it be found with any one of your servants, let him die. Moreover, the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves. He said, even so, in accordance with your words, let it be. He with whom it is found shall become my slave, but the rest of you shall go free. Then each one quickly lowered his sack to the ground, and each opened his sack. He searched, beginning with the eldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. At this they tore their clothes. Then each one loaded his donkey, and they returned to the city. So we'll conclude our conversation today with this passage.
Sure.
But there's a lot here. So Joseph was being super nice.
Right.
And now not so much.
Not so much. It must have been a little bit of time. They must have at least slept it off.
Yeah, yeah.
So a little bit of time between here and in the last chapter portion, but it's interesting that it doesn't say anything about they all having money in their sacks. They're just concerned about the cup.
Yeah, well, I'm sure they saw the money, but it's the cup that makes the difference.
Yes, that's
I mean,
right.
talk about a rash. So first, they do indicate that this silver cup that's been taken is the one used for divination. And that kind of, it's still setting them up because now they're thinking, oh, well, that must be how he knew what he knows,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because he's used this thing for divination. The Hebrew word there is nachash, and it means to divine through signs, like able to interpret signs and symbols and so on. And Joseph has already clearly revealed that he can interpret dreams. So probably wouldn't be unusual for the Egyptians to think that he had a mechanism for doing that. And he tells them it's the cup.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting obscuring, right? Because Joseph has historically told Pharaoh and the cupbearer, and it was God who interpreted the dreams. But he's obscuring that truth from his brothers, indicating that he knows the things he knows by divination, and they've stolen his cup. Almost like he's saying they were jealous of him or something. They noticed how much he knew and they took his cup.
Mm-hmm.
So the man comes, his servant comes, and he knows that this is all a put on, right? I'm assuming.
Yeah, he's the one who put it together, right?
Guy's a good actor.
Yeah, right.
What do you think he thinks is going on? Do you think he thinks Joseph is having fun, or do you think he thinks Joseph really wants to have at these guys?
I think he may be thinking that Joseph is having some fun. I don't know that he really he doesn't. I don't think he knows that he knows that they're his brothers, right?
And not his brothers, but they must know that Joseph is not from Egypt and that he's from that area. So it must be interesting to the Egyptians watching this, going, man, he's really given his countrymen some business here.
Right. Well, that's the thing though, because the steward does it necessarily imply for sure that the steward is actually an Egyptian?
He may not be. I think
I,
this guy is serving the role Joseph served in Potiphar's house. So I think it's a good observation for you to say he may not be Egyptian.
it says that the Egyptians couldn't eat with the Hebrews. It almost sounds like they wouldn't even like an Egyptian wouldn't do this stuff.
Yeah.
Like it would be kind of below him or something.
Well, I'm sure Egyptians had to interact with other nations, but eating was a big deal. Eating was a type of acceptance, which is why Jesus was criticized millennia later for eating with people considered by the law of Moses to be unclean. Table fellowship was a big deal. And in the New Testament, that's what Paul says about a man who's living in like overt sinfulness and unrepentant, and the church is ignoring it. And he says you shouldn't eat with such people. It's because eating had this level of kind of acceptance and approval, even
Mm-hmm.
of a person's lifestyle. So eating is much more intimate than interacting.
Yeah. You asked the question, does this guy really know what's going on? And I think he's just laughing underneath his skin.
Yeah, maybe he thinks it's just a game, but he also, it's probably not outside of the normal for very powerful people to take advantage of desperate people. And he could be thinking Joseph's doing that.
Right.
It's hard to say.
But in your mind, do you really think that this idea of divination is this out of the realm of Joseph? Is that something?
Yeah, I don't think Joseph was divining with the cup. I think that's an Egyptian practice. I think this is another way of him obscuring his identity.
Okay.
That's my impression, that he still doesn't want them to know his faith beliefs, because that's really the defining quality of the children of Abraham at this point. They don't have the Torah, so they don't have a whole bunch of laws that they follow that other people don't. There are two things that distinguish them. They're circumcised,
Mm-hmm.
and they believe in El Shaddai.
Mm-hmm.
So Joseph wants to obscure, I mean, he's obviously not getting naked in front of them, so they're not going to know that he's circumcised. And he doesn't want them to know he worships El Shaddai. So I think he's obscuring that.
Yeah. Well, some people would try to make excuses for this divination aspect, as if the servant or the steward knew that he used it that way. That's the question I have.
And he may have hidden, I mean, maybe this is a divination cup. I very much doubt Joseph used it for that purpose, but that may have been what it was.
He says, is it not from this that the Lord drinks?
Does he not indeed use it for divination? Yeah, I think that might have been an assumption.
Yeah.
It
Well,
could be an indictment, but I suspect it's an assumption because we've never seen Joseph use instruments to discern what God wants him. We've never seen that. It's never been narrated. I don't think it's being revealed here.
right. He's just running up their blood pressure, right?
With that said, this is not Israel under the law of Moses. God has not prohibited them from trying to read signs or anything like that. He never said that to Abraham. He never said it to Isaac. He never said it to Jacob. Certainly, he's never said it to Joseph. So maybe they do use instruments to try and discern God's will. That has not yet been outlawed.
Mm-hmm.
So it wouldn't be an indictment of Joseph if he did use it, because it wouldn't be breaking any laws that God revealed yet. It becomes a sin after the covenant of Sinai, but not before. So he might have used it. I'm just saying in the story, he's never been narrated using it.
Right. Yeah. It just implies it's here. It's obviously the sign to show that he's testing them.
So they were already in a situation where money appeared in their sacks out of nowhere. Why are they so forcefully? Would you make this vow? No, we didn't do this. We'll kill whoever did. That just seems ridiculous after their experience the last time, doesn't it to you?
Yeah, and especially what they've gone through, the meal and everything like that, and giving drink and the portions and the order. I'd be very careful what I said. I'd say we'll check, but I don't believe I took your money.
Right. I just find this to be such a rash oath.
Yeah.
The history of Israel is full of people who make really rash oaths and they never go well.
That's right. Who actually said it though? They just said it gives it saying it's all of them, right? It doesn't. It
Yeah,
just says they said. They
right.
all looked at each other and they said, "Whoever's got it, you can kill him."
Yeah.
It wasn't me.
Let him die. Back in Genesis 3, right? Well, or maybe it's in 2, when God gives the rule to Adam and he says about the tree of knowledge, good and evil, whoever eats of it will surely die. That phrase is mot to moot, will most certainly die. But the same verb that's there is here. And I've said this before when we talked about that word is usually used not just for natural death, but oftentimes for execution. That God might have been threatening Adam, whoever eats of this, I'll kill him. And it certainly means execution here.
So they'll kill him. They'll kill their own brother.
Or they won't fight the Egyptians if they want to kill him. I don't know. It just seems like such a rash and extreme. I know they're trying to protest their innocence, and I know they didn't knowingly do this. So they can't believe. I mean, it's amazing to me. You've got 11 guys here, and they so trust each other that they can guarantee not one of them did this.
Right.
I mean, if my brother and my sister and I were all in a place and we walked out and they arrested us for shoplifting and they said, we saw one of you take this, I don't even think I could with such confidence say, there's no way any of us did this, kill the one who has. I don't even think I could do that. And I trust my siblings, but that's a level of trust, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it seems extreme. What I'm getting with these brothers, and maybe I'm caricaturing them in an unfair way, the way they were gushing truth the first time they were here and they gave this long story. I think these guys are very impulsive, is what it seems to me. But we did say they drank, and you said maybe they slept it off. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they're still a little in their cups here.
They're still slurring.
The cup is found, of course, in Benjamin's sack, and that's meant to bring all of us to go. Yeah, I mean, we know Joseph knows, but what is Joseph going to do here?
Yep.
Now, again, this is before the law of Moses. After the law of Moses, they would have been duty bound to keep this oath.
Mhm.
And that happens in the book of Judges with a judge named Jephthah, who vows to kill whatever comes out to greet him first when he comes home, if the Lord gives him victory. And he does get victory. And when he comes home, his daughter comes out. There's
Mhm.
debate over whether he executes her or not. People try to make a big deal of it. I think the plain reading of the text to me is that he does have to fulfill that oath in his mind. He
Mhm.
has to do what he promised. And so after the law of Moses, this would have been even more
Yep.
devastating, because even if they spoke rashly, they would have had to execute Benjamin
Mhm.
because they swore that they would.
Mhm.
And I really believe that even though that's after the law of Moses, I think that sentiment exists at this time, because what we'll talk about next time is Judah's response. And there is such desperation.
Mhm.
Once that oath has been made, somebody has to be killed.
Right. They tear their clothes so that they know the seriousness of it.
Yeah,
Well, they say let him die, and the rest of us become the Lord's slaves.
right.
He says, he says, this one shall be my slave, and the rest of you go free. So he
Right.
modifies it.
I like that reading because it also means the Egyptian knows that they're making a really bad offer.
Right. Yeah. He says, well, let's see.
All right,
And
all right, guys, let's calm down.
it is interesting though that Joseph tells us the steward go after them, but he doesn't give them any real detail about what to do.
Yeah, and I
You
don't
know,
think the steward would have executed anybody without specific instructions. I would imagine that would be overstepping, which could also explain why he backed things off a bit. But he doesn't do anything. He just brings them back to Joseph.
right? And they're not going back for a good meal, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, Joseph is really, I've often asked myself, and maybe this is our concluding conversation, why this tact? What is he doing here?
Again, I think he's testing and just bring it, trying to sift them, and see if there's any change from the ones who sold them into slavery.
What do you think is what is he looking for? What's the test? What's the change he might hope for, do you think?
Whether or not they'll sell Benjamin down the river.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something there, because Benjamin, of course, is Joseph's already identified the fact that he's the likely heir, and I think they all suspect the same thing. And this would be a way to get rid of him,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
Simeon was the first test, right? Who
Hmm.
as I've argued, I believe Joseph believed Simeon to be the heir of Leah, and he tested by keeping him. But the real threat would be Benjamin to them, just as Joseph was.
Hmm.
And so I think I agree, he's found a way to give them a chance to do to Benjamin what they did to Joseph,
Hmm.
to remove the heirs of Rachel finally from the equation. So the only people that Jacob can consider is Leah's family. And he's
Yeah,
giving them that opportunity to eliminate the rival line entirely.
right.
And he wants to see if they'll do it. I think I agree with you. I think that's what he's testing.
Yeah. And I don't know that he knows all of he doesn't know the total effect on Jacob if Benjamin is taken out of the picture.
Yeah, I think until Judah speaks to him, which we'll talk about next time, I'm not sure he's even appreciating the effect on his father.
Right.
I think Joseph has other things on his mind.
Right. Yeah, he's trying to sift them out and see what they'll do. And you know, and in some ways they've been really honest, even in this difficult scenario where because they haven't, they say, why would we steal from somebody who's just given us so much?
Yeah. And we brought back the last money. Why would we do that only to steal more?
Yeah.
But of course, people do some strange things. So, but it does give you a sense that they're generally honest people.
Yeah.
Like they can't imagine that anyone would do this. So I don't know if they have changed a lot since Joseph's day, or if their hate for Joseph really inspired some uncharacteristic behavior.
Yeah, I think maybe the question would be, is it Jacob living through them, what he has said to them about bringing the gold or bringing the silver back and bringing more, and then presents as well, or is it their actual process of thinking, this is the right thing to do? And I think that's probably what Joseph is trying to figure out, if they're just doing what they're told on the steward compared to the steward, or if that's something that's actually the transfer. We talk about that sometimes in Christianity, the transfer from the parents' faith, and we've had that with Isaac,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Whether their faith has become their own.
Yeah. So it's just an interesting story to this point. We don't want to go too much further because I think the rest of this is quite a substantial conversation once Judah speaks up in Benjamin's defense. But what would you want our listeners to take away?
Well, there's always that issue of family dynamics, and the realization of struggle for power. And I think, more and more so, I look at families, and I often ask them, what are you really fighting for? The legacy of your family, the art, the gold or the silver or the properties, and you see a lot of needless pain that I think people encounter because of these things. And obviously, some of this is the birthright, the approval of the father, the struggle with property, and being able to have power and authority, control over the family. All these things are undercurrents that I think we see in this passage, that are driving the forces of jealousy, obviously, that are influences on the brothers, to encourage people to really take a sober look and what's driving them, what's the ground in which they stand on, and whether or not it's connected with this idea of whether we're destroying the family or destroying our relationships, or whether or not we're actually incubating and massaging something that is redemptive, that's growing, that's encouraging. And sometimes that takes a little bit of testing. Those are all things that we can draw from this.
Yeah. I think one of the things that strikes me in this story is the distance that can exist between forgiveness and trust. Joseph has clearly forgiven his brothers in the sense that he's not taking vengeance on them. He hasn't made them slaves in Egypt, which would be the eye for the eye, tooth for a tooth thing, right? He could have just conscripted them in, made them slaves, tormented them, taken their freedom, whatever. The accusation he first made that they were spies, he could have made that stick. So if he really wanted to get vengeance, he could have done it. And he's not doing that. So it's clear to me he's forgiven them, meaning he's not going to try and exact recompense out of them. But he doesn't trust them. And I think we're right to follow the tack that these are a series of tests in which he wants to test their trustworthiness, whether or not they learned from their mistakes, whether they're likely to do this again, how at risk his brother might be, how at risk his father is, whether the family dynamics have improved. It seems to me he's let go of what they did to him, but he still doesn't trust them. And I think that's a very biblical thing. It's very different. Forgiveness and trust are not the same. Trust has to be earned. And he's giving them an opportunity to earn back his trust by putting them through this series of tests. And he does learn through them that he can trust them. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but we've seen how honest they are. We've seen how they've tried to make right. These are very different men than he knew as a child. I mean, maybe they were always this way and their hate for him pushed them to some things that were out of character. But he's testing their character. I don't think it smacks of unforgiveness. I think it smacks of him not knowing if he can trust them.
Mhm.
And he is preparing to give them quite a gift because he wants to bring them to Egypt because he knows the famine has many more years to go. And he doesn't want them to starve to death. But he doesn't want to bring them close if he can't trust them. I think this is a series of tests. And we'd be good to remember that just because you've forgiven someone doesn't mean you can automatically trust them.
Mhm.
And the two are separate endeavors. Even though the guilty party often wants to conflate forgiveness with trust, they're not the same. And I think you can see that in Joseph.
Yeah. Those are good thoughts.
Well, we're grateful to everybody who has persevered to the end with us. But thanks for reading. And next week we will pick up in really the fallout once they get back with Joseph, how they're going to deal with this and what they're going to do to defend Benjamin or let him die. We'll see. I guess we've already given away a little bit that they're going to desperately try to save his life, which is a good thing, but we'll see how that all works out and what Joseph's response to the whole thing is once he really sees their character.
Right. Yeah. Benjamin doesn't go back. They shouldn't go home.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll get into that next week. But thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening. Blessings.